Hello and welcome to Season 5, Episode 5 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop,
I'm Mark Bishop.
and we are, of course, did you forget your name for a second? There's a long pause between me saying, I'm Adam Bishop. Did you forget your cue?
Zoom just informed me that it's being recorded, and so I had to. We're doing it by Zoom, and so
Of course.
I had to click on a little button that says "Got it" that I've never recorded.
Good. So you consent to being recorded,
I do.
100 plus episodes into this podcast. I guess I should have asked that first when we first started.
Well, and Zoom just sent me a note, an email.
Mhm.
I need to change my password because, according to them, someone is accessing my account.
Hmm.
Little do they know, it's you.
It is me because I didn't want to pay for the unlimited Zoom because if it was my account, we'd be kicked off after like 45 minutes or whatever.
I think our listener would appreciate that.
Yes.
Yeah, hard 45 minutes, but we usually talk for a few minutes ahead of time and then afterwards. So that would, but it would be
Yes.
kind of fun just to have a hard 45 minute and then it just cuts out.
It just cuts off mid conversation. Whatever we were saying at the time, that's where the podcast ends. That's just it.
Mid sentence. Yeah.
All right. But we are, of course, reading, sorry to cut you off. We are, of course, reading Austin Freeman's Tolkien Dogmatics, moving into chapter 4 with humanity. Kind of a lot of topics sort of crammed into one chapter here. A lot of interesting, varied stuff in this chapter. I like this chapter, of course, as you might expect. I know, surprise to everybody listening. I actually did enjoy this chapter.
So far, this is my favorite chapter.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. I like the philosophical discussion about
Yes.
humanity and all this and that. So, plowing into it, of course, Tolkien's views center around, humanity being the children of God.
Mhm.
So it runs throughout this entire chapter because that's, really what we are. And that's what Tolkien believed. And as a religious person, consistent with Christian or Catholic thought. But so it's interesting, so of course there's a discussion of, okay, in his writings, there's these other creatures that are obviously sentient creatures. It's not just, man and his dog, and you maybe question whether the dog is sentient or not.
Mhm.
I'm trying to come around to the feeling, well, of course, I always had a tendency to believe that dogs are sentient and possibly have souls, but I don't know if that's supposed to believe. But in any event, but with elves, I would think it would be even much more difficult to if elves existed, to say they don't have souls, I guess, because in some ways they're superior to humans. And then, of course, there's dwarves and orcs and all those other things in his fictional world. So we're children of God, we're made in the image of God. So what does that mean, according to Tolkien? And the discussion starts with the positive and negative aspect of being in the image of God or children of God, and that we're like God. This positive similarity defined as Tolkien thinks of as freedom and creativity, and then the negative is our mortality, what he calls homesickness, or the author describes as homesickness. That we're never really at home in this life because we been separated from God, I guess, in a way, and then we're going to be reunited after we die. And I always get nervous, although I think it's a good attitude to have. I always get nervous when people are so eager to end this life, to return home, if you will.
That is a good attitude to have. I don't think we should be like real like, yeah, let's leave right now. I think it's better to be a little cautious about that.
Yes, but it is. I mean, it's a healthy attitude to have. If you're devout and you truly believe you're going to God, and you're going to die and there's nothing to do about it, it's healthier to get to that level of acceptance as opposed to just wailing and gnashing of teeth and rending of garments. Anyway.
That is true.
So then then there's a discussion of freedom. Tolkien means by freedom because he has some, and it also touches on discussions we had earlier about fate, or these prophecies and chance. Because there's some luck of the draw and different things that are happening. And I like how Tolkien describes it as a human being is like a seed. And for a plant, when the seed germinates, there's a certain order, certain inborn traits and predispositions, but with a capacity to grow and develop fully. So, like, if you talk about like a tomato plant,
Mhm.
well, you have what is that? Like a Roma tomato plant. You're gonna have Roma tomatoes, but each plant's gonna be a little bit different. In each
Mhm.
fruit, the soil and the weather, and just it's a different plant. It's gonna have something different about it, and I think that's kind of an interesting way, a good way to view humanity. That
Mhm.
that there are limitations to our freedom because of how we were created. We're finite. We're not infinitely different, um, but we all are unique, and we have certain ways to grow and all. What do you think about so far? I'm kind of monopolizing the conversation.
Oh, that's
So
all right. No, I like that idea. I like the seed analogy. I think it's a very good way to get around the problem of like, if you're created by God and God gives you all these things, then is there free will? Because that's an argument you see all over the place. It's like, well, if everything was made by God, does anybody have free will? Because it's just all part of the plan. We talked about that a little bit last time with providence. But I do like the idea of yes, like, they're like an acorn to an oak tree. You know it's going to grow into an oak tree, but you don't really know what size and shape it's going to be or where exactly it's going to grow, where it's going to put its roots and things like that. So it's like, it's that's the difference between human beings as well. It's like, it's in my DNA, it's in my genes that I will never be 6'6". That's not something that I have free will over. That's something that's predisposed to me and to my genetics. But me not being 6'6" has nothing to do with whether or not I'll write a book or I'll listen to music today. It's sort of that difference of you do have a lot of control over how you develop yourself. Aside from just the physicality and stuff that is just inherent within you.
right, right, and in Tolkien's writings, his fiction writings, he has kind of a backdrop, as he would call it, a fate, which is the backdrop of the world in which we live in. Like maybe the major themes, may be fated
Mm-hmm.
or determined, I guess you'd say. I think he would say fated. I think he wouldn't really necessarily seem to believe in a mechanical determinism.
Mm-hmm.
So this clock is moving forward. It seems like he thinks there's a general purpose in the history of humans. And there's an example there that it's just a backdrop. It's not going to cause any individual things. Like so, the example is that Bilbo was fated to find the ring, through a number of events that occurred, but he was not fated to surrender it.
Mm-hmm.
And can you explain that a little bit more to me? And how do we know that he was not fated to surrender it,
So
or
that's kind of the
fated not to surrender
Mhm.
it? So I don't know how you say that. He did he did end up surrendering
Mhm.
it.
Yes. So it's kind of like the difference. It's like what Gandalf says to Frodo in the Mines of Moria. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. So Frodo, he gets separated from the dwarves in the Misty Mountains. He ends up down in Gollum's cave, and then the ring falls out of Gollum's pocket, and Bilbo stumbles upon the ring. So Bilbo had no control over the events that led him, upon entering the Misty Mountains to be separated from the dwarves and to stumble upon the ring. And there's even hints that it was, Eru, the gods, planned for the ring to fall out of the pocket. Bilbo had no choice in whether he came across the ring or not. That was just how events happened. But then he has the ring in his possession for many years, of course, and he goes off at the beginning of the Lord of the Rings. But it is firmly his decision to surrender it. He has full control over those events now. He could have chose to keep it, and it would be a very easy choice, a much easier choice to keep it. Of course, with the temptation of the ring and everything like that. But because it's in his hands now and in his possession, those are the events that he now has control over. And he defies the temptation and he overcomes that. Those are sort of the outside external physical things on him. He could have very easily said, well, the temptation's there, I don't need to fight against it, but he used his free will and he surrendered the ring to Frodo.
So are you of the belief that if Frodo would have decided, not Frodo, Bilbo would have decided to not go on that unexpected journey, would
Mm-hmm.
the ring have found him somehow?
I think so. I mean, it's this is just complete like theorizing now. There's nothing really in Tolkien's works, but it's because there's that element of like God's influence there with the ring slipping out of Gollum's pocket. I don't know if it necessarily would have ended up with Bilbo, because Bilbo, by and large, isn't the most important figure. I think it definitely would have ended up with Frodo at some point. It could have skipped completely around Bilbo, and still ended up either back in the Shire or Rivendell or somewhere, and it would have come to Frodo, because it needed to be destroyed. That is part of the backdrop of fate that is affecting the story. But then once it's in Frodo's possession or whoever's possession, then they have the free will to either keep it or destroy it, or do what they want with it. But there would be some element of fate that would bring it to the necessary people.
Right. And I guess I'm trying to think, back to the story of Bilbo.
Mm-hmm.
He decided at first not to go on the journey, but
Mm-hmm.
then he comes up with them. So at that point, when he finds the ring, had he actually changed the course of their journey? Probably not.
Oh yes, absolutely.
He had already changed the course of their journey at that point.
They would have all been eaten by the trolls. He saved them from the trolls, before the dwarves even get anywhere, really, because they're really only outside of the Shire, and they get picked up by Tom, Bert, and Bill, the trolls, and they're all being spun around the fire. And Bilbo is able to stall all of them long enough for Gandalf to come back and have the sun shine upon the trolls and turn them to stone.
Well, didn't the trolls capture them only because of Bilbo's haphazard activities that
I think
caused?
that was an invention of the movies. Yeah, I could be wrong. It's been a little while since I've read The Hobbit, but I think that was sort of made up by the movies of, because they have that whole scene where the trolls are stealing their ponies, and then
Right.
Fili and Kili, the two dwarves, are like, yeah, Bilbo, you're our burglar. Go take the ponies. I could be wrong. That could be something that's in the book, um, but I think it is Bilbo's primarily there is saving them from the trolls.
All right. Fair enough. All right. So then, moving on, I think we discussed fate and freedom, free will. So then, one of the big things, and I assume that you like this about Tolkien, among other things, is that he believes that humans, basically the expression of our souls, our creativity and art.
Mm-hmm.
To the next section is the positive aspects or analysis of our being the children of God is the fact that we're just kind of created to be creators
Mm-hmm.
because we're His image, and so therefore we necessarily are creative. And I think it's the discussion of the difference between elves and humans in his fictional world. I guess number one is elves are immortal,
Mm-hmm.
and so they have this kind of sadness about them. I just think it's discussed in the next little section, but also that they don't have the same kind of creative impulse that the humans do.
Mm-hmm.
Fiction, that they're more scientific and they're more studying of creation as opposed to trying to be creative.
Mm-hmm.
Tolkien, um, that he actually has actually said that the suppression of creativity is akin to satanic tyranny. I mean, that's how strongly he believes in the creative impulse, and that I thought you would like this. That speech and language, that type of creative speech and language, are direct gifts from God.
Mm-hmm.
To be able to communicate those things that you have discovered or created, also, and that art is an inescapable facet of our existence. He really, really stresses on that.
Mm-hmm.
So, what are your thoughts about that, and then about the poem? I have a question mark next to it. Mythopia. Do we already talk about that?
Mythopia. I don't
Yeah.
think we've talked about that before. I think I've read that. I don't really have a real solid reference for what Mythopia is about, but clearly it's about, his idea of sort of creativity and, why it's necessary, for humans to create. But I you were spot on. I do, of course, love his thought that speech and language are direct gifts from God. I can't remember if I've talked about this on the podcast before. But I think language is another one of those ways, the image and likeness of God, because we've talked about many times before, God is outside of space and time. And so how are we like God in that? Physically we are in space and we are bound by time. We cannot escape those things except through our words. We're the only living things in the world that can talk about stuff that is not currently happening or our plans for the future, tell stories about the past. We can make up, completely fictional worlds through our words. We are removing ourselves from space. We can make up stuff that's not currently happening or happened in the past or will happen in the future. We're removing ourselves from time. So I think that's one of the really big things about language that I think points to it being a gift from God. And of course, you're right. I do like the creative aspect. that Tolkien focuses on. We talked about that a lot last episode with subcreation. But I do like that idea. I think we are naturally drawn to creativity. I have a linguistics professor up here, actually, that's I think somewhat on the same track as I am. She's definitely an atheist, so doesn't believe in God, I don't think. She might have some minor belief in God, but definitely not a Christian, not a practicing religious person. But her belief is that humans made language in order to tell better stories. So she thinks it's a human invention, but we made it up so that we could tell stories because we have that creative impulse. So she's removing God from the equation. I don't think she would consider, why we even have that creative impulse to begin with. But I do agree with her that, that creative impulse is one of the reasons that we do have that such a strong, linguistic, feature of humanity. But it's just that it was given to us by God, and that creative impulse was given to us by God, rather than just us making it up on our own.
That reminds me, I was listening to a Joe Rogan episode the other day. I'm a fan. He's prolific. I don't have enough time to listen to it. I don't to talk to these people. Multiple episodes a week, a couple hours a time. But he was, I don't know if he's espousing it, but he was sharing the stone to ape theory of human evolution, including language, which was at some point in the distant past, chimpanzees or apes or whatever was our predecessors happened upon mushrooms, hallucinogenic mushrooms, and that expanded their worldview and their mind, and in a relatively brief period of human development, which is of course a wide expanse of time. And I think this is true, that the size of the human brain really became much larger as the humans evolved. And so he said, well, what if it was like, because they found these, of course, he loves hallucinogenics, and he believes that, provides him with, great truths and all that. And I was thinking of you as I was listening to him talk about how he thought it was a definite possibility. And there's his guest, who is, I think, a comedian, because he always has comedians on there, says, well, that could be true, but have any of us, have you really noticed anybody who uses hallucinogenics a lot be very productive?
I was going to say the exact same thing. I'm like, I think that can be easily disproven by giving a bunch of people a bunch of drugs and just seeing what happens. And I think the answer is nothing. Nothing will happen. They will sit around being high.
What followed was a discussion of people that they have met through their careers, which of course, these comedians meet all sorts of, wacky characters. And there's one of them, they said there's a guy that decided to take acid every day for 30 days and basically lost his mind.
Yeah.
And, I mean, like almost permanently. And they're talking about how people have come back from that, like they become paranoid and schizophrenic essentially, if they do that stuff too much. And I thought it was, I don't think Mr. Rogan has felt that his theory has been disproven by those many examples of their stoned out friends who lost their minds. Because maybe it would have helped the apes, but hurts us. There's a point of diminishing returns. But I thought, as I was reading this, I was thinking of that. I said, well, it could be a gift of God, or it could be just some mushrooms. I don't know. But moving right along, unless you have something to add to my mushroom.
I do not.
The next discussion point with regard to the humans and Tolkien's theory of humans being in the image of God and the children of God is mortality, and that differentiates the elves from there's a kind of a long discussion of the elves and the human differences because of this mortality and that we have this longing to be reunited essentially with God, and that we're does he get into the mind, body, spirit? I think that's not till later in the book, I guess. But
yeah, his big point, I think, in this section is about, what you're talking about with men and elves is the idea of like elvish reincarnation. Elves, naturally they will live forever. They can be killed, in battle, or they can die by grief. There's a few avenues towards death for them. But then he goes into this in a lot of like side writings. But there's very few elves that have like chosen to stay dead, essentially. Because there's like a special place for them in the afterlife, and they can reunite with their souls and stuff, or they have new bodies made for their souls and they come back. And they're.
I thought some of those orcs were like dead elves. that swampy place by when they're going to the bad place, and there's like
Mhm.
these buried elves in the swamps.
The Dead Marshes.
Yes, that thing.
Yes. So that's part of so to address the orc thing. Yes, in a lot of Tolkien's drafts, orcs were like mutated elves, essentially taken by Morgoth, the supreme evil being, and he corrupted them and he made them into something else. Tolkien really kind of walked back from that later on in his life, because he was thinking, well, if you have this, pure soul that will remain forever and always returns to the world, it can't possibly be corrupted. That was essentially his metaphysical thought on that. Can't be corrupted. So he sort of shifted that in his later writings. It wasn't published until after his death, but he sort of shifted that to orcs were really once, malformed men. It was men instead of elves that were taking the place there. So he kind of recognized sort of the discrepancy there between his thoughts. Regarding the Dead Marshes, it's still possible for the soul to remain, and this is a whole thing. He does have like ghosts in his works, essentially. If the soul remains in the physical world and doesn't go out into the afterlife, then it can still haunt the world, and that's kind of what we're seeing in the Dead Marshes. But his overall point is that elvish souls are tied to the world, but the souls of men can go somewhere else. They go to Eru, they go to God that is beyond the reach of any of the elves. So that's the two big differences between the races, is that the elves are tied to the world, the men are something beyond the world.
Got it. And so Tolkien in this part of the book is our author is describing Tolkien's views that basically death is a curse, which can be transformed into a gift if accepted with faith. And I guess in some other later chapter we may talk about the afterlife and all that kind of stuff. But because because of this process and the separation, I think this is kind of a wild point, is that because the Earth is not our home, the humans become bored with it. Humans lose interest in it and become homesick for the eternal. And that like Augustine's famous dictum that our hearts are restless until they find their rest in God after
Mm-hmm.
death. I don't really think about that too
Mm-hmm.
much, but
Well, I think the quote from Bilbo at the beginning of Lord of the Rings is like a perfect example of that, because the ring unnaturally, prolongs his life, and he tells Gandalf, I feel thin, sort of stretched, like butter scraped over too much bread. That sort
right.
of idea. I've been here too long. I need to go somewhere else. This is not where I'm meant to be. And I think you might see some of that, in real life with some older people who are very, very old, and kind of what you were talking about earlier, sort of, looking for, my time here's done. I've done what I needed to do. Now it's time to move on.
Well, and there's a discussion. I think we're going to get into it here in this next little section about the sorrow of the elves. Because
Mm-hmm.
so much that they have seen and experienced is filled with sorrow now. I mean, and when you meet someone who is elderly, and I'm 52, so I'm getting there quickly, but it's in their 80s or 90s, there's a lot of sorrow because if they had a spouse, odds are they've lost the spouse. Certainly their parents are gone. Most of their siblings are gone, if not all of them. And there's a gentleman I know that just passed away at 99, and he was the last of his. He had a twin brother who passed away years ago, but he lived a long time. But it's been, I mean, I think he died in his 80s, maybe. His brother, but
Mm-hmm.
that's a long time ago. He's passing
Mm-hmm.
away. He's a very active guy, but he had two marriages, both of which lasted longer than my marriage currently is, which is 26 years.
Wow.
And he's a two-time widower. And so just thinking about that practically, but he was actually a pretty upbeat guy generally. But most people that that are older, of course this guy had a lot of faith too, but most people that are older have that kind of like underlying layer of sadness because of so many people they've lost. And they're maybe more ready to accept the possibility of going to meet those people and a God and all that kind of stuff. And I think the books and the movies did a pretty decent job of describing that sorrow, although the
Mm-hmm.
movies could do a better job of it, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but anyway, so what are your thoughts about that? The differences between the elves and the I guess we can go into a little
Mm-hmm.
bit more
Yeah, if you want to
different.
go into more detail there.
Like where the elves, whether the elves were created before men in this Song of the Valar.
Mhm.
I don't really care. I don't know what the but I guess I guess it makes a difference, to this author or people that really want to study it. But that the elves are fundamentally similar because they're both both the elves and men in this fictional world are created by the god figure, but that we have this creative freedom and the mortality that the elves almost wish they can possess, and of course the men would wish they'd have the ability of foresight and the other long life,
Mhm.
perhaps the elves have, but we can't have, which is an interesting um, interplay between the two races, I guess you'd say, these
Mhm.
two people, and that the elves are their main characteristic is beauty and appreciation for beauty and study of nature as opposed to creating their world around them, and men are more creative in changing their environment perhaps. What are your thoughts?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I like what he has to say here. It's a very interesting dichotomy that I don't think you really see in any other like fictional world. Like I think really Tolkien's the only one who's really looked at this sort of interplay between like immortality and mortality. What's the better one? And part of what makes it really interesting is what he says on page 106. Their
I do
doom is
want
to.
Hold on, I need to interject.
Mhm.
The Highlander movie is a great commentary on immortality.
Mhm.
So it also has Sean Connery in the original Highlander, which he is a Spaniard who just happens to have a Scottish accent. Very excellent acting on the part of Sean Connery as the Spaniard. But go ahead.
That's lovely. But he says on page 106, talking about the elves, he says their doom is to love and beautify the world, never leaving it, and yet to make way for men, fading as men increase and come to enjoy the world that the elves have prepared. There's a sadness intrinsic to the elves who are destined to live only by the mingling of their bloodline with that of men, as with Aragorn and Arwen. In the final perspective, might we even conclude that in God's plan, the elves only exist only to ennoble the human race. So it's this idea of I mentioned this earlier, but they're tied to the world. And so what you see in the Lord of the Rings, it's not really explained in the movies, and you kind of have to really dig deep into Tolkien's works to get to the reason of this. But all the elves are leaving the world. They're sailing to the west. They're going to Valinor, and it's like, okay, well, why? And part of the movie is just like, well, just because that's what they're doing. But there's this whole idea of they are sort of tied to the light of the Valar, the angels, gods, whatever you want to call them. But that place is like no longer in the physical world, and only the elves can get there. So if they want to live, they have to get over to the Undying Lands and live there in the light of the gods. Um, but if they don't, they're kind of stuck in the. And he describes it in an interesting way in one of his works. I forget exactly where this is coming from, but he says, if they exist for long enough, the elves will just sort of shrink. They'll become filmy, like they'll become transparent. They'll essentially go back to being just a soul, sort of wandering the earth. They won't have any physical form if they're sort of stuck in the world, because men are increasing. It's the time of the men. Their time on this world is done. So it's this idea of, you can live forever, but only if you are now sort of separated from this world that you were once tied to and shaped completely. So it's a very sad idea. And of course, a lot of them lived for thousands of years and saw, complete, change in the world. So it is this interesting idea of sadness and of sort of having to completely remove yourself from everything that you know in order to keep living. It's interesting. It's sad. It's very sad.
I would wonder why they wouldn't nap all day, because they always I tomorrow or next century. I mean, it would be hard to be productive, I would think,
Mm-hmm.
but I guess maybe the other elves would get on you because
Mm-hmm.
nobody trash or something, because everybody gets, oh, you do that tomorrow. So I guess you'd have to have some sort of order, because if you all live for thousands of years, the day-to-day chores, I don't think he properly explored how difficult it would be to maintain order under
Mm.
those circumstances, and
Yeah, I
to
mean,
maintain a rule, because they seem to be like monarchies,
mhm.
family monarchies, and you would think they'd have, I don't know, but because they go on for so long.
Hmm.
I
Well,
don't
I
know.
mean, that's a good point, and I think he does sort of address it a little bit in the Silmarillion. This is going back into more, 1,000-year history or whatever. But the biggest problem that sort of the elves faced that essentially led to a big split between, all of the elves. Is the elves really thought that they were higher than the gods. It's like we can shape the world, we can make things, we can do things. And so you have this guy Feanor who creates, from the light of the trees, which is a whole other thing, but he creates the Silmarils. That's what the Silmarillion is named after. Is these three jewels that he creates that essentially has the light of the world within them. So it's this idea of, well, we're higher than the gods, and that leads to this kinslaying, where it's the first time, blood is really spilled between elves, and it's just a massacre of elves on elves because, one thinks that they're higher than the gods and the other doesn't. And so it is a lot of this idea of, how do you maintain order when, they think that they're eternal, that they think they're better than everybody else. And you do have that exact thing. And it's like, okay, you just kind of have to give these different kingdoms their space, essentially, because they do go to war with each other pretty frequently in the Silmarillion. It's like, how do you maintain that? By the time of the Lord of the Rings, so many of them have sort of faded or sort of, diminished into lower stature, lower power, that it's just not worth them fighting each other anymore. But they did do that a lot in the past.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Good summary.
Thank you.
So moving on, if we can, I don't know if you want to discuss the interplay between men and elves anymore, but there's certainly hobbits.
Mm-hmm.
Next one, which are hobbits, are a branch of the race of men, which I don't know that I knew that or considered that. They're basically like little men.
Yes, pretty much.
And they're more connected to the natural world, being the little that they are, and they tend to be free from ambition and greed, which is good. And the author describes this as a way to symbolize, really to demonstrate the amazing, unexpected heroism of the weak and ordinary. And I think that's really the draw for a lot of the Hobbit movie and for the Lord of the Rings, is that it really is a celebration of what somebody who is weak and who is just pure of heart and just tries to push forward through all sorts of obstacles because it's the right thing to do, and then ultimately has some success through a highly unexpected series of events. But what are your thoughts about that? That the hobbits are that type of example, and how they fit into this hobbit world?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because it's like, I don't think Tolkien really knew how to answer it at first, because he didn't expect The Hobbit to be a hit. He didn't really expect it to connect to his overarching, fictional world. We've talked about that before. So it's like, well, they have to be men because they're not elves. They're not this new race. They're similar enough. They have to be a type of man. And I think it's sort of man in like a peaceful state of nature almost. It's not a state of nature where they're killing each other, but they don't have a very complex civilization. There is like a mayor of the Shire, and there are sheriffs and things like that, and that's sort of the infrastructure that you have. But by and large, they each have their own home and they just have their own garden. That's just kind of what they do. And so it's an interesting idea that he pulls like the greatest heroes out of these people who 99.9% of them do nothing to sort of shape the future, right? They are more than content to just live in their own tiny little cloistered community and just do nothing for the most part. Not to say that, farming is nothing and, having a family is nothing, but shaping the course of history, the hobbits aren't doing that. But Gandalf sees something special in these people. Their morals are good. They care about what is important. That is the world, and that is their families, and that is what is, green and good in the world. And so it's kind of, you have to take this unexpected person to make them like the greatest hero. So it's an interesting idea of, are they important? They're like so unimportant that they're the most important of all, right? Because they don't have grand aspirations to rule the world. They don't want to, shape history. They just want to do what is right. And for a lot of them, doing what is right is just staying in their own community. But if you pick the right person, what is right is saving the world.
And it really feeds into this story about who really is who's the strongest type of person, or what is the strongest type of person to resist the temptation of evil and power? Is it the person that is strongly saying, I can resist, I am so strong, I can resist this thing? And it seems like the strongest and bravest, in a way, are the ones most tempted to use the ring because they feel like they could wield that power successfully. It was only through some of the weakest people, Frodo and Bilbo, who really didn't want anything to do with it. They were just carrying it out of the sense of obligation and they were the ones most able to resist the temptation to use it
Mhm.
for another purpose other than to either just carry it along or to ultimately destroy it. What do you
I think it's the idea of we might have talked about this in the podcast before, but any politician who really wants power is the last politician you should vote for. It should always be the person who's like, I don't want to do this, but I see the need and I need to get it done. That's sort of the attitude of Bilbo and Frodo. And you kind of compare that, you'd think the most powerful person in the world would be the one best equipped to handle power. And I think Tolkien addresses that very clearly with Boromir. Boromir has the best intentions of the world. He wants to defend his kingdom. He's the most important man in the most powerful kingdom in Middle Earth, Gondor at the time. But he, in trying to do the right thing, he's his own power overtakes him. He's tempted by the power of the ring, and he says, I'm better than you, Frodo. I need to take the ring. It's important. We need to use it against him, and that's sort of what you fall into if you give a very powerful person who wants power that power, then they're going to do bad things with it. Whether they intend to or not.
Good point. All
Thank
right.
you.
Yes. Moving along to the other creatures,
Mm-hmm.
dwarves, which initially I guess it was created by this. I forget how you pronounce the name.
Outlet.
Aule,
Mm-hmm.
Aule with the little dots over the E like Motley Crue. Uh, yeah, is that over the U or the E? Anyway, in Motley Crue. So they're not creations of God, but God, I guess, infuses them, according to the story, with some sort of soul, and God then makes a female version of them, which we get into in a little bit, the male and female.
Mm-hmm.
But the females look very much like the males, evidently, which has been commented on with some humor in the movies, um, which makes the jokes a little bit more realistic, I guess. Although I found the female dwarves reprehensible in the Amazon series.
Yes, yeah, that was something because everybody's like, you see a bunch of people like saying online, well, there's a bunch of Tolkien quotes that are like, the female dwarves looked very much like the male dwarves. They had beards and whatever, and all the women dwarves in the Rings of Power series, none of them have beards, and it's like, it feels like such a small thing, but when you're connecting it to like this theological creation, then it is a significant thing because these weren't created by God Himself. They're sort of twins to the male dwarves because they were made by Aule and they're sort of, not the intention of God to even exist, but he allows them to exist because he's this merciful creator and things, and Aule's given them a sort of life, and so he allows them to prosper. So it's this idea of, sure, it doesn't really matter whether or not a female dwarf has a beard or not, but when you look back into like the history of Tolkien's writings, that is a sort of a significant thing if you really want to lean into that.
Yeah, and I don't. When I was reading this, I was thinking, why would the left wing weirdos that run Amazon want to have essentially two dudes be husband and wife? I mean, having the female being so close to the male, it's indistinguishable, would serve their political purposes.
Mm-hmm.
So because it'd be trying to meld the genders
Mm-hmm.
into.
Well, I don't know if
Oh,
I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but it's the exact flaw with all of the Rings of Power stuff. They have pleased nobody because it's like they've completely changed the story of what is written in Tolkien's works. They've condensed thousands of years into like the span of a month, maybe, in the show. So it's like you have all of these named characters that are in Tolkien's world that should not be doing these things at this time. So it's like you're angering all the people who really care about the work because it's condensing the timeline, but it's like, why wouldn't you just make up characters? Because it's like the people who want to watch the show who don't know about the books, they're not going to care, who these named characters are because they don't care about the work. So it's like, you've upset both people in a way. So it's like, why do I care who these named characters are? But it's, if you've made them, into this thing in the show, then you're angering all the people who do care about them. I don't know. It's weird. They've just found a way to make nobody happy.
I think it's through their general incompetence. But in any event, so getting back to the dwarves, I'm kind of confused from the book. Is the bottom line, do they have souls or not? Do they not have souls? There's a discussion in there that initially, I guess Tolkien was saying they didn't have souls because God didn't create them,
Mm-hmm.
and that they're more mechanical and just really interested in money. But they were creative. So that they you say, well, they're not artistic, but they certainly were with regard to their arms and their mining
Mm-hmm.
capacity, building great cities and mines.
Mm-hmm.
But what are his thoughts, if you know, about whether dwarves had souls?
So initially, I think the dwarves weren't meant to have as big of a role in his works as they did. Again, it's sort of the Hobbit problem of, okay, now we have 13 dwarves in Bilbo, and those are the main characters in my best known story out of this whole, fictional world I've created. And so it's in the Silmarillion, dwarves do appear, every so often. They're somewhat frequent characters, but they're never the main characters. The Silmarillion's all about the elves and eventually the men, and they have battles with the dwarves, and sometimes the dwarves help them, but they're sort of pushed to the side. But once you sort of bring them into the focal point and you focus on their characters a lot more, it's like, well, why shouldn't they have souls? And he mentions at the very end of this section, says there's also a very late note postdating the manuscripts from which the Silmarillion is derived, stating that from the beginning, the dwarves are the third children, which would imply that they are a third race and that they do truly have souls and they are the children of Eru. And so I would lean towards that and Tolkien's, final thoughts on the subject. But initially, when he's writing the Silmarillion, of course, much more mythological work, not really focusing on the characters of any one people and things like that. So it's sort of, I think they would have souls in Tolkien's understanding at the very end, but throughout the writing of the Silmarillion, he wasn't thinking of them in that way.
And with regard to the other beings, it looks like we're going to have to wait till chapter 7 to really discuss them in earnest, being the eagles, which are really used as a plot device to rescue them at times where they're unable to be rescued.
Sure.
To just flying from point A to point B and so that there's no justification for the entire journey. But anywho, and then there's Ents, orcs, trolls, dragons. Do all those have souls? We don't know. Wait till chapter, I guess. We'll discuss it a little bit more. And maybe some of them are irredeemably evil. Therefore, they can't be creatures of God. I don't know. I guess we'll discuss that in the future.
Yeah, maybe.
But then there's a discussion of fairies, and we're talking about the supernatural fairies.
Yeah, this is
we're thinking of.
Yes, that's great, Dad.
Fairies.
Yeah, this is interesting because this is talking about fairies like in the real world, not in Tolkien's writings. Fairies themselves appear nowhere in Tolkien's writings, really about Middle Earth, like as a race or as a being there. But he says, is it possible for fairies to exist in the real world? He says that on the one hand, fairies are near in stature to humanity, capable of sin and fall, able to take human shape and doomed to immortality while the world lasts, and afterwards perhaps nothing. On the other hand, they are non-incarnate minds or souls, appearing as human only because that is the impression they make on our own souls. Minor demons are spirits who aided God in making effective his divine idea for some particular element of the world. So it seems like he does believe in fairies, that there is something out there that exists that is supernatural, but it's sort of a catch-all term for anything that is not human and that is rational in the world. So I think that's sort of what he's looking at, for demon possession. You could call that demon a fairy because it is this supernatural thing that is entering the physical world, or maybe even, angels, if they existed within the world physically at any one time, that would be sort of an instance of a fairy. I don't know. It's hard to tease apart his thoughts on the subject here because he never really elaborated them.
Right. So moving along to the body and soul. And this is a frequent discussion in philosophy. How does the physical body communicate or interact with the soul? And he talks. You probably are more interested in this than I was. The Elvish words "fia" and "hra," which signify roughly soul. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. Soul and body.
You are.
And then "fia" is associated with breath, which is very similar, like the Holy Spirit. The Greek and the Hebrew, and then the other one. Oh, and also radiance, for light and all that kind of stuff. So what are your thoughts about the discussion of body and soul in this part of the chapter? The body, the how it interacts, this fire, and the soul, if that's different than spirit, if that's interchangeable in Tolkien's world. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, this is referencing a lot the Athrabeth Finrada Andreth, which we've talked about, pretty at length before. But it's very much a lot of their talk here is centered around the idea I was talking about earlier, with sort of elvish reincarnation, and the difference between elvish souls and the souls of men, with Fea and Hroa, those two words, in that the elvish soul is not really tied to any one specific body. Like I said earlier, they can be reincarnated in a different body, but still have the same soul that they did as the person they were, thousands of years ago. But men have one body that is really created for them, and that is the body that they will inhabit until they move on into what is next. And so it's this idea of, how do these interact? Especially if one can be reused and the other cannot, essentially. And it's they don't really reach, a very satisfying conclusion, really, because it's just two entirely different ways of looking at it. Is if, is the soul one eternal thing that can keep existing in the world, or is it one eternal thing that has to go on somewhere else because it can only be tied into the world in one specific way and no other way? So it's interesting.
Yeah, and there's a discussion about what Tolkien's beliefs or in his writings about the souls being you know non-spatial, so not in space, and can be united across any distance, but can only be fully commune with one another when their bodies are near. When like as far as people that are living, and it's not until after you die that you can actually commune with God or I guess others more fully. So there's like this belief that the human soul is so intertwined with the mind and the physical body that it's part of the soul until the body dies and it goes off, I guess, on its own. And then there's a discussion at the very end of page 115 about that the soul is immortal and indestructible even by God. And I thought that was kind of interesting. I hadn't even thought of that concept, or if I have, I've forgotten. Can God destroy a soul? And I think Tolkien says no. God has created something indestructible, and I don't know that I believe that.
You don't believe that?
That God can't just destroy a soul.
Hmm.
I guess that would explain why there's hell.
Yeah, yeah. I mean that's true. I mean, because it's interesting. I mean, it's really a discussion about what the soul even is, and sort of what God's power is. But if God says something, okay, this is indestructible, this is eternal, I'm assuming he would follow his own rules, right? It's if it's indestructible, if it's eternal, then that applies to God too, since he made that rule and he has power over himself, I guess. Um, I don't know, because I would agree with Tolkien that it is eternal and that it is indestructible by God, because it's just, I mean, well, first of all, I don't think God would have any interest in destroying a soul in the first place. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's I don't know exactly what the reasoning is, but I do feel compelled to agree with Tolkien that it is indestructible by God.
I guess if the soul is part of God, it's like
Hmm.
say, so if it's part of God's essence, then God can't create it or can't destroy it because it is, undestructible part of God.
Hmm.
Uh, and part of God's essence. But the rule maker thing, I don't buy because, as you may recall, in my youth, when I was a little kid, I would play multi-role games, like board games, by myself. So the four players, but I'd set certain basic rule, like you play Risk, and Risk
Hmm.
is roughly a chance game, but there's some strategy in there. And so you'd say, well, the rule I'm going to play as all four players is, I will only attack under some conditions. Well, if the game got too lopsided or I wanted to end early, I could just change that rule.
Hmm.
Starting the next round, the rule is blah, and it's not blah or whatever. So I would think the same type of concept would apply to God as the rule maker. That, well, if God makes the rules, God could just change the rules. Why would God be able to say, well, I can't destroy these souls, and then just get have a really bad soul and say, you know what, I changed my mind. I could change them under these limited
Hmm.
circumstances. I will kill this soul because it's
Hmm.
really annoying.
Well, not to insult you too much, but I think God is infinitely more fair and infinitely more patient than you are. So I think it's a different type of rule making. I don't think the analogy of a board game really applies, because in a board game you're not fundamentally shaping reality, of course, unless you really want to get into the mind of a little Risk arrow piece. But it's not. It's not an eternal rule. You're not shaping things, and God as a shaper, as a founder of reality, if he changes the rules of reality, it would almost be like, he's starting from scratch. It would have to be like a new reality, because it'd be something entirely different. If you're just changing the rules of a Risk board game, you just want, your game to end earlier, your sad sort of game with yourself. And you're just changing how these pieces interact on a board. You are not making your own Risk universe, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I was making a Risk story similar to Tolkien's creation of Middle Earth.
Hmm.
There were competing interests and characters in a history of interactions between these different colored armies. There's yellow and green and red and black
Hmm.
uh, Roman numerals back when I was playing those games. So I think your point is well taken, although I disagree. I think if it's just a rule, God can change a rule. Whether it's a good idea or bad idea, I guess it's always a good idea because it's God's rule. So He's not going to
Yes,
make
that is
by
true.
definition. But so anyway, I just thought that was kind of an interesting or different thought that there would be that limitation on God not being able to destroy a soul.
Hmm.
I'm not sure why. Anyway, moving on to our favorite topic, gender. Oh my gosh, gender. And of course, there has to be, I did like the author's description of it because I was starting to read this. I thought, oh, here comes the disclaimer of why Tolkien's a bad person because the word misogyny is in it in the first paragraph. But he says Tolkien has long been accused of misogyny for his dearth of female characters and outdated views. But then he goes in and he describes a philosophy that is accurate, both historically and with regard to human behavior, which I thought was kind of funny. So he kind of had a disclaimer in there first, but then accurately described the philosophy, which is that the genders are equal but not the same; they're complementary, and that it's necessary to have the male and the female in order to really have an effective long-term romantic love relationship, et cetera, which of course would infuriate some people who cannot seem to bring themselves to have an effective heterosexual loving relationship. Uh, anyway, so but this is part of God's design of having the male gender and the female gender. Not saying one is better than the other, but they're generally different. And it was kind of funny when I was reading this. Like there's on page 117, where he mentions, as a rule, young men do not really want friendship alone, even if they say they do. A male desire for a female can be purely physical, but a woman's desire for a male means she wants to bear the male's children. And I have him next to that in handwritten. Andrew Tate, if you're familiar with Andrew Tate, it's almost a quote from Andrew Tate, who is now out of the Romanian jail,
Hmm.
which I don't know if he should be in the jail or not. I think that's kind of a flip a coin. Because I think he says a lot of things that are true and accurate about the relationships between the genders on average, but I also think he advocates for men cheating on their women
Yes.
uh, inappropriately, and I think if he lost that element, well, I think he'd probably have less of a draw popularly.
I think
Uh,
to kind of take it away from Tolkien to just sort of talk about Andrew Tate for a minute. I think he's weird in that he's essentially what a lot of like the left thinks that traditional arguments are. He takes the traditional arguments and uses them as evidence for, cheating and sleeping with a lot of women. I think that is so a lot of people are like, oh yeah, Andrew Tate, he's just bringing us back to old-fashioned morality. I'm like, no, he's not. He's just saying, there's a difference between men and women and blah, 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 and going on biology and gender and stuff like that. But he's taking it in a fundamentally cheat on your spouse and have sex with lots of women direction. And that is not the traditional approach, not by any means. And I think that's what a lot of people are very mistaken about Andrew Tate.
yeah, and he's funny because a lot of what he says is true though about I think about certain natural propensities, but also about well about a lot of maybe tendencies,
Hmm.
but certainly he does not espouse any sort of moral theory. You know,
Hmm.
his theories are all 100% amoral.
Hmm.
And it is, he's just saying that women are devaluing themselves and in the view of what do they call them, like the top 1% males, or
Hmm.
what do they get the term they use? to describe the super desirable men.
You think he's
And
alpha males, I think is what he says. Yeah.
yeah. I think that's right.
Hmm.
And so it's funny, uh, but I guess in that world, because I think he still speaks of that world or from that world, which is
Hmm.
this uh, amoral a society where you're just valuing men and women on their money, looks, and power.
Hmm. Well, he's interesting because I think he is a Muslim, I believe, at least nominally. And I still remember when he was first sort of making headlines and appearing in like podcasts or whatever. I was talking to my friends. I think it was back over last summer, and they were like, "Yeah, this," because I'd never heard of him before, and they were like, "Yeah, this Andrew Tate guy, he's kind of cool. He's saying some interesting things that some people are getting mad at, but I kind of agree with it." One of my friends goes, "Yeah, and he's a man of God. He says he's a real man of God." And then my other friend goes, "Yeah, and he's got 3 wives." Like, I don't think those equal each other. I think you have some contradictions there. Yeah, it was just ridiculous. But yeah, it's this idea of sort of conflicting these different ideas. It's strange. He's a very strange man.
But yeah, and I guess it depends on which God you're talking about. I mean,
Mhm.
because have multiple wives in other religions. But anyway, I think that the discussions of gender and are pretty much garden variety, political and social and religious thought from just as short as 50 years ago. I mean,
Mhm.
this when I was growing up, this is just like black letter law. I mean, it was accepted that women are women and men are men, and neither the twain shall meet, I guess, in
Mhm.
some respects. And then everything has been changed as far as what people say they can do or what people say they should do.
Mhm.
Uh, but certainly, I don't know that I agree with everything Tolkien was saying, because he even said he used his female students as examples. An intelligent woman can quickly grasp the male teacher's point, but can rarely go any further on her own, he opines.
Mhm.
I don't think I agree with that.
Mhm.
But I think he's right that on the whole
Mhm.
and on average, men have certain propensities and certain characteristics, and women have different propensities and characteristics on average.
Mhm. And
I think that is true, and I think part of that is why he has the characters he does have as far as the female characters and the interplay that they have within his stories.
mhm. Yeah, I want to touch on the female character thing, but I think another point that's really important that's been, I think, completely lost in like popular discourse is the point that gender is part of the soul and not of the body only, is what he says here. Souls are both gendered and familially related. Brothers and sisters are spiritually related in a way that husbands and wives are not, for instance. Like marriage, the family relation involves both body and spirit. So it's not just a biological thing of, what chemical, balances you have in your brain, versus, the other gender. It's also, within your soul. It's part of just who you are entirely. And, to sort of say that you're not, one of the two, or you're something else, in Tolkien's mind, I think in a lot of people's minds, that is a very grave offense. That is not, just saying I'm being who I want to be, I'm being who I really am, because who you really are is your body is tied to your soul, and your gender is male or female, and that's just the way things are, especially in Tolkien's view. And the idea of the female characters in his works, he starts off saying, the accused of misogyny for his dearth of female characters, as you mentioned. It's interesting. In one of Tolkien's letters, he kind of answers the question of, why do you have so few female characters in your works? And he kind of answers, well, I'm just bad at writing women. I think it's much better for me to write about a bunch of men and do them justice than to write about a bunch of women and make them all, bad characters, because I can't think like a woman. I don't know what a woman would do in every single situation. So he has these few female characters that are very, very important in his stories. Galadriel and Eowyn and Arwen, especially, are very, important characters in their respective works and things like that. And so it's like, it's that difference of, it'd probably be worse if I had a whole bunch of female characters, because they'd all be bad female characters.
That's an excellent point.
Mhm.
Maybe you just didn't have the ability to write their dialogue as well.
Mhm.
It makes sense. Certainly no female authors are under the obligation to write a whole bunch of male characters in there.
Mhm.
under
Yeah.
a present day. So, why can't he just have a whole world where the main characters and movers and shakers are men? So anyway, but I think it goes to the point of the soul being gendered is I think is really powerful stuff, and it could be really reassuring to people who are struggling with it now, which I think they miss that entire Christian theory of your body is your temple, essentially,
Hmm.
that every person. And I think we touched on, I know we've talked about this before, but I don't know if we said it in a podcast, but if people really had a belief, if they had a belief in God and they were created by God, and that they and their body and their soul were gifts from a divine, a benevolent divine creator, they would maybe perhaps be able to accept that however they look is good, you
Hmm.
know, and whatever gender they are is good, because that is the way they were created physically. And maybe they feel like they have different feminine or male characteristics or traits or personality traits, but there's no reason why you can't feel that way in the same physical body. It just doesn't make any logical sense, that you were created by God.
I think we're going to eventually see that come back into the left in a very weird way. And this is assuming that well, this is based on the assumption that they don't want, complete contradictions in their worldviews, but I think we've already seen that they do. But this idea of, especially with like the real environmental people that are like, Mother Earth and everything needs to be exactly the way that it was, according to nature. I think if you really, really buy into that idea of everything as it naturally was, then the natural conclusion of that is I am created as I naturally should be, through the world. And, these very man-made procedures designed to change that, should not exist. And we should not, just as we should not be, forcing destruction upon the forests and completely changing, hills and landscapes, I should not be changing my own body in that way. I think we might start to see that school of thought. I think it's possible that we'll see a very, very small portion of people in that school of thought. You keep shaking your head more and more aggressively. I don't think you agree.
That will never ever happen, because for a couple reasons. Number one, their entire belief system is based upon what is preferential for them and what is convenient for them. And so they believe, just like they espouse, that the way they think is reality. Their opinion is reality. So that opinion was created by Gaia. That feeling that they are a man or a woman in a man's body that feeling was created by this, by nature. Or else they
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't think it. So
Yeah.
so you are wrong 100%. They will never come to that. And
I'm very sorry.
it makes too much sense. And it's really all about power.
Hmm.
Uh, Power and change, and thwarting the effective societal bonds that have brought us to this wonderful world of prosperity and law and order. They just want to destroy it. But anyway, on to society, and the things that also liberals would hate, mainly
Hmm.
that morality is universal. There is a moral code that applies to all humans and all other creatures. The moral code of Tolkien applies. What's good and bad applies to elves, hobbits, orcs, and everybody else. There is moral judgment for bad things or for good things. And of course, Tolkien's belief is that our chief purpose, I think we said this early in the book, in our podcast about the book, that the chief purpose is the glorification of God and an increase of our knowledge of God, and that our knowledge of one another aids us in accomplishing this. So, the number one, we should glorify God, and we should try to learn more about God and each other, and that is the main purpose of life. And if we all thought that, the world would be a better place, and that there's certain moral code that you can't just change because you feel like it,
Hmm.
which would be nice if people really believe that. But I never knew that he was in some sort of club when he was young called the TCBS. I don't know what that stands for,
Hmm.
but that their I guess founding principles are religion, human love, patriotic duty, and nationalism. sounds like Sounds like Biden would have them arrested. Uh, fascist, fascists, patriotic duty and love and religion and nationalism. Up against the wall, firing squad. Anyway,
Hmm.
and then he goes on to, he certainly believes, as any right thinking person, and I mean right by correct, that society requires a religious element, and he states some things that are just reflexively and known to be true, that the more cohesive of religious beliefs in a society, the more cohesive the society will be.
Hmm.
And even, and that's what people have been saying for 200 years about America, is the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is a broad religious belief. It's not a certain doctrine, but certain beliefs of God the Creator, and that there's a certain moral and ethical code that everybody has to live by, or else. And that is trying to be swept aside at this time. And of course, Tolkien, as a Catholic, uh, would believe that to be true, and I think that really is kind of resonates within his writings and his stories, that there's like this moral code among all these people.
Hmm.
There's this evil corruption that's trying to destroy that from within and from without. So what are your thoughts about his thoughts about society and Tolkien's views on that topic?
Yeah, I mean it's a section here which includes a whole lot of stuff. But yeah, I mean, of course, I agree that there is, 100% a moral code between, everybody in the world. There is what is right and what is wrong, and it doesn't matter where you live or what time you live. Some things are always right and some things are always wrong. It's you can't say, well, I was raised an orc, and so, I like to kill people, and that's just part of my society, and you can't tell me that's wrong. Yeah, I can. I think it is wrong to kill people, and that is just a universal thing. In the same way of, it makes me think of, when the British were colonizing India, and they stopped the burning of widows, and the Indians were saying, well, why are you doing this? This is part of our fundamental beliefs, and our fundamental truth is this, this is a very sacred ritual. And then the British commander, whoever was in charge, yeah, well, it's part of my 100% belief that it is wrong to burn widows. That's the thing. It's, we do have universal beliefs that are eternally true.
Well, I think the real response, if I remember correctly, was we believe that the killing of widows it demands the death penalty. I think that's
Yes. Hmm.
what his statement was. All right, you're going to abide by your code. You're going to kill this old lady. Well, I'm going to execute you.
Hmm.
That's what stopped it. And
Yeah.
so it's not just I believe; it's that I'm going to act on the belief.
Hmm.
That enforce this societal rule. You can try to do that stuff and kill these poor old ladies, but we're gonna string you guys up,
Hmm.
that would certainly cut down on the killing of old ladies.
Yeah. that would cut down on the killing of old ladies. That's true. But yeah, the TCBS is also an interesting thing. This was like a club that he was in with just a bunch of his friends, sort of when he was young, pre-World War One. And I think it was four members in it, including Tolkien. Half of them died in World War One. So this is like his childhood friends that he developed, this love of literature. The name of the club, TCBS, stands for the Tea Club Barovian Society, so reference to some literary work, I'm sure. But sort of, an appreciation of, art and literature, and also, a pride in one's country, that nationalism idea. And of course, two of them died, in support of that idea of nationalism, of preserving your country and things like that. And so that I'm sure that had a profound impact on Tolkien. And he references that a lot in his letters about his childhood friends dying in World War One, essentially.
Yeah. World War One is just was I mean, of course, every war is horrible, but World War One was just such a complete waste,
Mhm.
in a strategic sense. Just so many men were just thrown in and slaughtered. Uh, that it's amazing that anybody came out with any belief in God after that.
Mhm.
But like if you read, what was that reading? Hemingway. I've been reading a lot of Hemingway, and he seems to have come. His writings are almost the inverse of Tolkien's,
Hmm.
like this cynicism and amorality and atheism, also a lot of alcoholism too.
Mhm.
But compelling stories. He's obviously a beautiful writer, and I enjoy reading them to a point, but I have to stop after a while because they're so depressing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I
Uh,
can see why.
Not a lot of inspirational thoughts of goodwill coming from Hemingway, but certainly there are from Tolkien. But they both had. Well, I think Hemingway had involvement in the Spanish Civil War, so I don't
Mhm.
know if Yeah, I think so. I think he would have been after. I don't know if he had any experience in World War One. Now that I think about it, maybe he did. But I know he had experience in the Spanish Civil
Hmm.
War, which prelude to World War Two.
Hmm. It's interesting that you bring up the Spanish Civil War. Tolkien has a letter. I forget why he's talking about the Spanish Civil War, but I think he's asked, about, and I think there is a reference here about him saying that Tolkien's either sort of a supporter of either anarchy or monarchy, and that the fewer the those in charge, the better. And somehow the topic came up of who did he support in the Spanish Civil War, and he says, well, Franco, of course. I'm not with those crazy communists. I'm with the guy who's in support of his own country. And of course, that was a big thing for Tolkien, was one's own country and one's own history. Of course, I mentioned this several episodes ago, but the Middle Earth as sort of a mythology for England and stuff like that was a big element in his life. Sort of that pride in one's country was very important to Tolkien in preserving that country, of course.
Yeah, the statement was on page 121 that by
Mm.
1943, Tolkien classified himself as an anarchist or an absolute monarchist. I would, bearing that out, that either there's very, very, very few rules for anybody, or there's a monarchy. And as a Catholic, you really didn't have much of a choice. If you're a devout Catholic, believed in the Roman Catholic Church, you couldn't really be on any other side than Franco, because they were slaughtering those nuns and priests. I
Hmm.
mean, it was it would be considered war crimes, modern day, because they didn't have an international code back then, but not enforceable, or it really isn't enforceable anyway. It's just a victor that enforces it. But there are a lot of atrocities. I'm not saying Franco was a good guy, and I'm not saying I would have supported Franco, but you'd be hard pressed to. Well, it'd be impossible to support the communists, or they were called the Republicans, I think, at the time,
Hmm.
or believers in the Republic, which they swept in, and all these so-called reforms. Now, of course, there were. Anyway, I don't want to get too much in the Spanish Civil War, but I mean, there was needed reform, because the church was not an agent of positive change at the time. But that doesn't mean that you round up all these nuns who are just in a convent, praying or do whatever they're doing, and executing, they're burning down their buildings and all that stuff. And so that radicalized Franco, or the pro Franco side, and that's what you get.
Hmm.
You force the split of
Yeah.
the population, and you just have lots of death. And that's the worry for modern United States, is if we keep letting people keep forcing us apart, and not realizing that on the main issues of governance, we should be very much very, very close. But well, time will tell, I guess. But
Very
anyway, so
true.
Tolkien has a very interesting philosophy and thoughts about all these things: God, and morality, and society, and gender, and all those things. So do you have any? I don't know if there's anything you want to cover specifically, or if you have any final thoughts,
Mhm.
general topics of this chapter.
Yeah, just the last point here, especially coming from last season with the whole history of political theory, but his point about absolute monarchy really is just bureaucracy in the faceless and impersonal state really troubled Tolkien. He hated that idea of, okay, everybody now is an agent of the government and they all have some sort of power over you and all of these agencies. He hated that idea, sort of the industrialization of government, if you will, to kind of put it in sort of a Tolkien view. The fewer people in power, the better, since bossing other men is the worst job a man can have, is what he says.
Yes.
He says almost nobody is fit for it, and especially not those who seek after it. Of course, tying into our talk about temptation and power earlier. Says, thus, as he remarks, the medievals were right in holding a man's desire to avoid a bishopric as his best qualification for the position. But as Tolkien observes, the strategy only works if the one man in power remains relatively inefficient and limited. A single madman with an atom bomb is still a fearful prospect. So this idea of sort of one king, so that we don't have just a sprawling government, but keep that king so he doesn't really have direct influence over somebody's individual life. He sets the code for the country, and that's about it.
Yeah.
Is I think would be Tolkien's ideal government there, which is an interesting idea, and I can't really argue too much against it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I thought you would have some thoughts about that. Evidently not.
Well, I have thoughts, but I'm feeling long-winded.
All right, do you want to wrap up this episode? Any other closing thoughts from you?
No, I think I enjoyed reading
Mhm.
it and studying what he had to say, and commenting on it. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's all good.
Lots of varying ideas there. Well, if we don't have anything further to add, you can, of course, follow us on Twitter to get updates on the next episodes and things like that at ULMTD Opinions. That's ULMTD Opinions. This has been Season 5, Episode 5 of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop. I guess we should have given an update on our T-shirt. Do we tell the audience that our T-shirt got rejected because of copyright infringement?
I don't think we told our audience about that. Yeah, we had a big picture of Joseph Campbell, and I even checked. It was under Creative Commons license on Google. I made sure to filter by the correct things, but I guess it is still a picture of an individual person, regardless of if he's been dead for 50 years. We can't slap his face on the back of a T-shirt. So we'll probably just go with the quote. I haven't redesigned the shirt yet, but that is still forthcoming.
And we have a winner, so we have to get that out.
We do. We had the winner from last time. We still have to think about what we want to do for this season, if anything at all.
Well, some of these gender quotes are pretty good.
I don't know if somebody's going to want to go around with like a mug or a baseball cap saying, female students do not have aspirations beyond the classroom. I don't know if that'll fly too well.
Well, I maybe I shouldn't say this, but I just bought a Babylon Bee T-shirt that says "woman," noun, adult, human, female. That's A, or B, anyone who drinks Bud Light. I thought that was kind of funny.
That is pretty good.
I was kind of hoping people could laugh at that, but I don't know. What do you think? Because it's insulting Bud Light.
If it were me, I would not be wearing it on campus. That's for sure.
Huh, I guess I'll have to visit Kirksville.
There you go. All right, we're gonna end the episode there.